people, welcome to the Lunar Practice. This channel, I cover all kinds of topics around the completion process and parts work. If you don't know what that is, you can check the description box below where I link infos about this. So actually today we want to cover enmeshment trauma. This was a topic that was highly requested by the completion process community, and I invited Rowan Garlow here to interview because she's a completion process practitioner like me, but she was actually my mentor when I did the training, and she is like so experienced and so knowledgeable and just like a super cool person. That's why I thought I'll interview her. Yeah, so welcome. So happy to have you.
Yeah, thank you for interviewing me. I'm excited to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, so I ask you what's kind of like your favorite topic, and enmeshment trauma was definitely one of those. I think a lot of people are very confused about what that is. So yeah, please just explain what it is.
Yeah, so enmeshment trauma is coming out of people that come out of dysfunctional family homes. So typically, enmeshment trauma comes out of a family dynamic where one of the caregivers is controlling in some way. There's a permeable boundary between these two people, or sometimes between multiple people, in a really unclear boundary, so that, you know, this one person that might be seen as a separate self and this person that might be seen as a separate self become this fused identity, and not necessarily in a healthy way. So much so to where the child in this situation loses parts of themselves, loses pieces of their own identity, loses their own emotional compass system, and everything that kind of helps a person healthily navigate the world. And they kind of lose that core sense of self, becomes fragmented because there is no individuation process that's really respected, or there's trauma along the points of the individuation process. And so that results usually in an adult with what we would call enmeshment trauma, which has a bunch of different symptoms, shows up in a lot of different ways for different people. But yeah, is basically the byproduct of a dysfunctional relationship between a caregiver and a child that's typically too close. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there actually is a healthy emotional connection either. It can be a kind of closeness that's more felt from the person who's on, like the child who's on the receiving end of that, more as an invasion. So we'd call that more of like an incoming boundary violation, where it feels like the person's energy is really just like moving into your field and you don't really have a choice about that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting because I did a CP with a client just 2 days ago, and I thought, wow, she has maybe enmeshment trauma, because she had this trauma where she felt like her mom was like feeding off her, and she was yeah,
totally.
So she felt like her mom was hugging her, but her mom wanted something from her. She wasn't hugging her to give her something.
Yeah. And that's a really good point, that it can feel like, you know, there can be one thing happening on the outside, like, oh, this person's just giving me a hug. But if there's some unconscious things going on in the mother, for example, like really I had this child so that I could serve my sense of self, or so that, you know, whatever it is for that person that maybe they're not even aware of. And that's still transferring onto the child in really subconscious patterning ways, because we're very intelligent and we have to be that aware of our surroundings, especially when we're that relationally dependent on our caregivers. So it might look like one thing, but it can feel very different. And that kind of becomes the problem, because the parent's perception of reality and potentially the child's perception of reality can be really different. And we just don't even realize we're encoding and like passing on that dysfunctional way of relating to people, which is a gaslight, because you're seeing one thing, you're feeling another. Maybe you're also not getting validation for the fact that you feel like your boundaries are being encroached on. Like, say, if you do try to say something or detest, like that doesn't fit in with the narrative, then it can be really unconscious. Like, it's not to say that these parents are insidious in any way or like necessarily doing this to harm their children. But a lot of it can just be really passed down and unconscious.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's such a good point. Like, in all of this, it's not that parents are like evil people. It's
Right.
just that often they are so unconscious about their own pattern. And I think that's a very good example where probably the mom at that moment maybe was not even aware of what the energy she was giving off.
Right.
And also, I think a big problem is, yeah, as I also said, that we do not perceive children as these super sensitive beings that are, I think, because maybe even they think less, that they are so aware actually of like the energy that people are giving off. And I think that really needs to change. It's the same, for example, like I've never met actually a child that didn't know from a very young age, oh, the parents had relationship problems and they were finally getting a divorce. And the parents are often like, oh, we are not going to tell the children, and the children know. So.
Yeah. Or that's a whole other topic of
totally.
Staying together for the children. And then a lot of times it's not realizing until much later that, oh, maybe I actually should have separated, and maybe that actually would have been the healthy thing, because sometimes what that teaches is, just stay in unhealthy patterns like I did. It's like,
totally. And so, can you give some examples? How does enmeshment trauma, to what does it lead? Like, what kind of maybe behavior or what struggles adults have?
Yeah. So one of the main things is you'll see people either having an inability to regulate their own emotions, or oftentimes wanting to intervene in other people's emotional processes, rescuing other people, and then also feeling like they need rescuing, because that person was really never able to learn what their own emotional system was telling them and to trust it. So a lot of times you have adults that just can't deal with emotional turbulence in relationships because of how much it's affecting them. It can create really empathic type of children. It can create, just because they're already enmeshed, like they already learned how to enmesh with another person, so much so that they lost all of themselves. So losing themselves into someone else is easy, but it a lot of times leads to like a person who doesn't have an identity. They might be in a relationship, and that person they're in a relationship with might become them in a way. So if there's like a turbulence or something that stands to maybe like threaten that relationship, there can be like a fear response. Interesting. The reason it's like challenging me right now is because this is the kind of almost the same symptoms that you see in abandonment trauma. And so I was kind of getting them mixed up in my head for a minute, because that's the same, like the person's identity will become absorbed in the person, because all they've known is relationships are very intense, and things could change very quickly. Because if you are enmeshed with a caregiver and there is a lot of turbulence in the system of your family system, like there might also be like you've broken off from yourself, and a lot of times there's also in the family home other people breaking off from you. So there's this constant like pulling away of selves and then crashing back together in really intense ways. So in like interpersonal relationships in adulthood, it can be difficult to not only manage their own emotions, but not knowing like how to handle distressing situations, because they had no clear model of how to orient as a self in a situation and like advocate for themselves as a separate being, if that makes sense.
Totally. And I was also just thinking, that basically the enmeshed child also feels super alone, like the abandoned child, because they are never seen for themselves.
Totally.
So I think that becomes also really clear. And it's also very interesting, because this client, where I thought, oh, she could have suffered from enmeshment trauma, the energy was giving off was pushing away. So she was like quite confrontational with, but she was like, I need connection. No one can connect to me. And that's also what Teal said in her video, Teal Swan. We'll also link the video below about enmeshment trauma. She says, when other people come into the room, you immediately cater to their needs. And that leads to you wanting to be alone and fearing this being with people, although that's like your biggest wish, basically. Yes. But it's so intense for you that maybe unconsciously you're like pushing them away all the time.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why it's really confusing, right? Because on one level, you're like, oh, I really want connection. But every time I go close to that, my being also signals that this is not okay for me. This is scary and dangerous. And so enmeshment trauma, a lot of times also, like you're saying, leads to people who are intimacy phobes, who can't get into relationships, who said, you know, these are the people that say, I haven't been in a relationship in 20 years. What's wrong with me? I can't seem to really like other people sometimes, or even, getting close to them. It's like, I really want this. So it's like this like disorganization from, I want this thing. When I go towards this thing, all of a sudden, all the red alarms in my system start going off. Danger, danger. Especially if that person has done any kind of internal work with themselves, because now they're starting to recognize like, oh, this is dangerous. I don't want to go towards that. Instead of recognizing like not all relationships have to be that way. And so as with any kind of really thing that happens in childhood with other people, healing from enmeshment is really going to be about helping people to find safe relationships where they can kind of negotiate these terms of boundaries in a really conscious way. So that they even get the experience of what it's like to have somebody respect your boundaries. And, you know, potentially working with somebody who's like a somatic therapist who can actually do physical boundary work with you, where you're, 200 feet away from the person, you start where it's most comfortable. And then that person slowly, and you just watch what happens in your system. And this can kind of help to encode or break down those encodings in the body that say threat, danger when somebody's coming close to me. But also, I actually really want them close to me. So it's like this whole mixed bag of emotions happening.
Totally. And you know what? I actually just remember when we did the completion process together, like one other practitioner was doing it on me, and you were helping her. And that was the perfect example. So how was it? I was triggered because I had an aversion against the practitioner. And I was like really angry. And I was like, I don't want to do this with her. Why did she like pick me? And then you said, go have your space, And I was like, what? I was like, okay, I'll go and have my space. And I was crying and crying. And through this experience, I realized, oh, I'm not angry at this person. I'm angry at my mom, because she always made me do things, help people I didn't want to help. And then when I came back, you two were still there, and you told the practitioner to say like, hey, I'm here. You can have your boundary, but I'm not going anywhere. I will not be angry just because you have a boundary. So.
Yes. Yeah. And it's great. Like you said, it's really healing for the body to have the experience of walking away and then being like, oh, this is a choice. I actually can walk away, and there's not negative consequences for that. No one's leaving on the other side. So it's really like this crazy experience for the body when its boundaries have just been violated time and time again. And it's like, whoa, this is different.
Definitely. For me, it was like such a breakthrough. It was the best session I had on our training. And I see people, she is an amazing practitioner.
Yeah. Oh, you're so sweet.
Yeah. So, boundaries definitely like super important. Do you have anything else that could be like really good, like treatment for people?
Yeah. So definitely the somatic therapist. Working definitely on those like core root traumas, right, where you can either consciously remember or not consciously remember situations where, and by doing that, by really actively looking in your life currently, what's going on, like what are some current ways that I'm like violating my own boundaries or letting people violate my boundaries. And you'll only know that by really starting to look at what social situations am I in, or situations I'm in with just myself, right? Because we can violate our own boundaries too. And that becomes the pattern a lot of times for people with enmeshment. So they might, let's say, keep themselves up later than their body really wants them to, or drink more than they should or need to, or so just starting to notice like when something's uncomfortable in your body, because that's usually a signal like, maybe this is something I don't prefer. What's just been happening in my environment. And so if you're not sure what your boundaries are, going back through and just throughout the day, like checking in with yourself through every little thing, like, do I like this? Even if it's something you know that you like, just while you're eating something, or what parts of it do I like? If it could be different, how might I have it be different? What could be even better than this thing? Or just kind of starting to suss out, because our boundaries as people are always changing, and we should really allow ourselves that adaptability and flexibility to have a sense of self that's a little bit fluid. But it's really going to be about that like toddler stage individuation of allowing yourself to try things for the first time, and get a sense of who you are. And I mean, it can be a really exciting process because it's like looking at the world for the first time. But yeah, that's really helpful. Getting in touch again with your own emotional guidance system. And that's like, again, checking in with yourself. How do I feel about this? And not necessarily at first maybe going right in to try to change something, but just notice, as the observer, I have the capacity in my own body to notice when my being as a unique organism is signaling to me that this is something that I do or don't like, and just starting there. I think that's really crucial for people to helping re-stabilize an identity, because that makes relationships easier. Like if we're stable in here, we can actually go outside of ourselves and interact with other people in healthy ways. But not to say you need one without the other. But yeah, and then obviously having conscious relationships with other people. Other people who can actively show you that they really do care about your boundaries and really will be asking you. And you can, I know for some people that might seem wild to even think there are people like that out there, but I've met them. You know, you're one of them. There's entire communities of people who are into trauma recovery and care about learning boundaries. So it exists, and it's important to have those relationships, because if you're still in a dysfunctional environment, or you still have those old patterning with other people, it's almost like you don't even want that anymore when you actually have what a functional relationship can look like. And it's like, well, I don't know if I really need this support necessarily. I might turn these relationships into something else and really start using the people who are able to have functional relationships with me more often. So it's really important.
Definitely. Wow. So I think that was a really good overview over enmeshment trauma. Maybe like we'll do like a super quick recap. So I think the most important things to remember is that when you feel like you can't be yourself around other people, it's definitely a sign that you could be suffering from enmeshment trauma. When you feel like you have like no boundaries whatsoever, you're maybe depleted after spending time with people.
Yeah.
And yeah, the most important thing for you is to know what your boundaries are, to create them, and to find safe relationships where actually the other person cares about your boundaries, because they know you will be so much more happier and healthier and able to really be in a relationship with them and not wanting to push them away.
Totally. Yes.
Okay. So thank you so much for doing this interview with me, for sharing all your knowledge.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much for letting me talk about it.
Absolutely. We're two nerds talking about trauma topics. So yeah, guys, thanks so much for watching. We actually have a second part of this interview where we cover the opposite trauma of this, which is abandonment trauma. So stay tuned. It's going to come next week. All the best.